The Refutation of All Heresies is a masterpiece, written against 33 competing Christian sects. It contains material that is found nowhere else against 8 supposedly Gnostic Christian groups whose works are closely paraphrased. This work is an indispensable resource for understanding early Christian diversity. It is a treasure trove showing how Christians interacted with Greco-Roman philosophy, astrology, astronomy, practices that are now called magic, divination, and a host of other practices. Now, you'll often see online and even among scholars the reflexive attribution of this work to a figure called Hippolytus. It seems to me that this is mostly a scholarly reflex, but as I've argued in the introduction to my annotated translation in 2016, this attribution to Hippolytus is not secure. This work comes down to us anonymously. The only ancient ascription of this work is to Origen, with the result that around 1860, the first edition of this work was published under Origen's name. But this work has also been attributed to men like Gaius, the Roman presbyter, and even Tertullian and Didymus the Blind. It was only in the late 19th century when the name of Hippolytus gained supremacy as the author. But the arguments upon which that theory was based are shaky at best. And it's my intention in this very short presentation to present some of the data, evaluate it, in order to show why it's not secure to refer to this author as Hippolytus or Pseudo-Hippolytus, which doesn't make a lot of sense since the author never claimed to be Hippolytus in the first place. So first of all, who was Hippolytus? Well, Hippolytus was a writer of biblical commentaries, probably somewhere in the Eastern Roman Empire. His best-known works, arguably, are the commentary on Daniel and the commentary on the Song of Songs. And he is best known as a commentator. Eusebius mentions him and specifically says that he doesn't know where he's from, which is a surprising fact. Jerome then takes over from Eusebius. In terms of other concrete data about Hippolytus, we don't really know very much. Eusebius and Jerome attribute a heresy catalog to him, but it doesn't seem to be identical with the Refutation of All Heresies, which is called in Greek an elenkos. And the very fact that many church writers, both East and West, wrote heresy catalogs should make us pause in the identification of this writer with the Refutator. The more we know about the Refutator, the more it seems that he was different than this Eastern commentator and bishop. By contrast, the Refutator, or the author of the Refutation, was definitely a Roman writer. He tells us that he was in Rome and that he was, or had some sort of what he calls high priestly duty there. He takes great pride in his learning, and he was clearly interested in philosophy. These are traits that we don't find in Hippolytus, the Eastern commentator, both in terms of style and in terms of the interests of these authors. There seems to be some significant differences. Cardinal Newman was onto something when he claimed that he couldn't believe that Hippolytus wrote the Refutation because it contained such a scathing attack on the Roman bishop of the time, Callistus. And it is a scathing attack. I recommend everybody pick up Book 9 because Callistus is not only shamed and regarded as a heretic, but is regarded as the culminating heretic who is in a line that stretches way back. And by virtue of making this attack, The Refutator indicates that he is not writing from within at the time what would be recognized as the early Catholic tradition. He is opposing those who are claiming to represent this tradition, calling Zephyrinus, Callistus's predecessor, an ignoramus, and writing an attack on Callistus, which shows him to be an opportunistic former slave and a mismanager, and then a heretic outright, although he occupies the Roman see. From what the Refutator himself says, we can piece together certain other facts. He seems to have written 3 other works: a work called On the Universe, or Against Plato, which again highlights his philosophical interests, another work called Chronicle, and an earlier heresy catalog, which he describes as written hadromeros, that is in a more schematic or rough fashion than the Refutation of All Heresies. In my view, the Refutation of All Heresies was written as a kind of magnum opus, a heresy catalog that would trump all other heresy catalogs, including that of Irenaeus. In later centuries, the Refutation of All Heresies was itself trumped by other heresy catalogs, like that by Epiphanius and Phalangius. But in its time, that is the early 3rd century, and for at least 150 years after that, no other heresy catalog came close to dealing with so many other Christian sects. And it is still the case that in terms of the level of detail, in many ways, the Refutation is unsurpassed, in particular in its tendency to closely paraphrase unknown sources or sources unknown anywhere else. But the plot thickens because on a statue found in the 16th century, we have both the Chronicle and On the Universe being inscribed on the back of this statue, the plinth. And what's even more fascinating is that this statue, after being found, was heavily damaged and restored to look like a man, when in fact, as Margherita Guarducci showed in the 20th century, this statue originally depicted a woman, and it's still evident that this man is wearing a dress. If you look closely at his feet, you'll see that he has the bordered garment of a lady. And there's some dispute about who that lady represented. Suffice it to say that we don't know exactly who created the statue or whether it was reused by a Christian community. And we don't know if the writings inscribed on the statue are actually contemporary with the statue. At any rate, it seems plausible that the writings on the statue aren't attributed to one single author, especially if the woman on the statue represented a generalized figure of wisdom or the church. The writings ascribed to wisdom or the church would be from various authors who found themselves in an ecclesiastical tradition. But one of the chief reasons, if not the chief reason, for thinking that the author of On the Universe and Chronicle was Hippolytus was because certain other works that were inscribed on the statue plinth looked generally like they were titles overlapping with works attributed to Hippolytus by Eusebius and Jerome. And on a general level, that's true. But if you look closely at the titles on the plinth, for instance, titles like On the Passover and Against All Heresies, these are general works. And in terms of their exact title, they're not precisely the same as the works ascribed to Hippolytus. The other complicating factor here is that some of the works on the statue no longer survive, like on the Pascha. And so we don't really know what they contained or whether they in any way jived with the style or the interests of Hippolytus, the Eastern writer. And when you combine this with the general point that the writings on the statue are probably from multiple authors, it seems unwise to say that all of them were ascribed to Hippolytus, the Eastern writer, especially because two of them, namely On the Universe and the Chronicle, are works of the Refutator, who never says that he was writing commentaries, and he never says that he was from the East. In his time, one could still write Greek in Rome. Now, you'll often see a tendency on Wikipedia and among some scholars of wanting to connect dots that aren't really connectable. So, for instance, we know from a later 4th century work that there was a presbyter called Hippolytus who was martyred in 235. But there's no strong evidence that this presbyter called Hippolytus was the author of the Refutation. There's no reason to connect the author of the Refutation with this figure. The author of the Refutation would, in all likelihood, never accept the title of presbyter. There is no evidence that he ever reconciled with the bishops of the early Catholic Church. There seems to be a kind of rosy historicizing in which he repents and does reconcile with later bishops. And this would indeed make for a interesting story. Unfortunately, there is just no solid evidence of this whatsoever. And the fact that the Refutation passed into near oblivion, that it circulated anonymously, and that the other works of this author, for instance, On the Universe, were ascribed to other authors, in this case Josephus, indicates that the writer of these works was under a cloud, which indicates to me that this writer never reconciled with the early Catholic tradition or the institution that was run by Callistus. And therefore, his writings could only survive anonymously and through a very narrow line of transmission. In fact, we only have one single manuscript of the Refutation, books 4 to 10. We have lost books 2 to 3, and books 4 to 10 were only found by chance in the mid-19th century in a monastery on Mount Athos. It was very likely that we could have lost this work entirely and never known about it. So I hope you can see, even through this whirlwind presentation, why I'm not comfortable ascribing this work to Hippolytus or Pseudo-Hippolytus or whoever. This work is anonymous, and for the time being at least, it should remain anonymous, because if we ascribe it, or in my view, misascribe it to Hippolytus, we put it into a context in which it actually does not belong. And we make certain framework style assumptions about who the author was that just aren't correct, or they misrepresent who this author was and misrepresent what he was trying to do in his time. For those of you who are wanting to go further and learn my entire argument, hop on my Patreon and you can download a PDF version of this book, which includes my introduction, all my notes, and all my arguments in very close detail. For now, I want to thank everybody for coming along and having a listen, and I hope you will continue with me in this intellectual journey. Leave a like and a comment. I'm happy to have your feedback. Take care.